In this lesson, we are talking about PowerPoint and how you can use PowerPoint to give a more impactful sales presentation. I'm talking about both preparing your PowerPoint slide deck and also delivering it to your audience. Now keep in mind, these are tips and guidelines, not hard and fast rules. In fact, every audience is different and your situation might be unique. You may need to bend or even break some of these rules, but it's a really good idea to know what they are and know what makes a better PowerPoint presentation. It could really help you along the way. So, rule number one, you're building out your deck. You want to know where to start. Start with a dark background. If you have a blinding white background in a dark room where the lights are turned down, it's going to be really frustrating for your audience to focus in on that. And a lot of times that's where you are. You're in a classroom type of setting and the lights are turned down. You're better off just using a dark background. Usually they look a little bit more professional and they also allow you to focus in on your material. Next up, go for clean and simple. And I'm talking about both the design and the content. Focus in on one key message per slide. And you might have one image and maybe a few bullet points. Don't overdo it with bullet points. You want short sentences. You want maybe 5 or 6 bullet points maximum. And more often, probably like 3 or 4. If you look at this, you might recognize the Apple advertisement from the mid-2000s. This was a hugely successful ad campaign for Apple that featured the nerdy Microsoft guy versus the really cool, suave Apple guy. And part of the success of this advertisement was the simplicity. They had a simple white background. I know it wasn't dark, but a white background worked well for TV. But the content itself was really easy to follow along. They had clever dialogue and they always focused on one key point per advertisement. They didn't go off on a list of features. Every advertisement focused on one key point. And that was really a big part of that ad campaign's success. It went on for many years. Next, consistency in style. Again, you're going for simple, but be consistent in your font. Also, with your background, you might want to mix it up a little bit, but not too much. Keep that same background flowing throughout your presentation. This goes the same with your transitions. There's a lot of transitions that you can use, but you want to be consistent in what you do. You don't want to have a slide in and then a zoom in, zoom out. You want to keep it consistent throughout your slideshow. Don't overdo it with features. You can use PowerPoint, or maybe you're using Apple's Keynote, or there's another program called Prezi that's very popular. All of these have the ability to add animations, to add charts and graphs. You can have stuff flashing in, flying in all over the screen. Just use these sparingly. Don't go too crazy with the features. Your presentation is what you want people to focus on. I'll tell you, be very careful with Prezi. The transitions that you use in Prezi oftentimes zoom in and zoom out, and it looks fantastic. And I'm not saying never use it, just be careful on overdoing it. I once gave a fantastic presentation to a group of bankers. And I had a big world map and I zoomed in and zoomed out the entire presentation. And I was surprised at the feedback I got afterwards. A number of people brought up that, hey Brad, good presentation, but it was hard to follow sometimes because of those transitions. So just be keenly aware. I've been very aware of that ever since, and I've toned it down on the transitions. And I would recommend just don't overdoing it when it comes to whether it be features, animations, or transitions. Keep it relatively simple. Font size matters. Your font size should always be 30 points or greater. I didn't make up this rule. This rule actually came from Guy Kawasaki, who was a marketing genius in Silicon Valley. Many years ago, he came out with this rule, 30-point font or bigger on your PowerPoint presentation. I think it's a fantastic rule. It keeps you using smaller and shorter sentences. It only allows you to put a few different bullet points on. And it's really something you should adhere to in your PowerPoint presentation. 30 points or greater with your font size. Now, if you're using 30 point or greater font size, some people get really caught up on having too many slides in their deck. And while you do have to be aware of it, it's better to have clear and concise slides and having more of them as opposed to trying to cram everything into 12 or 15 slides. I would rather have a slide deck with 30 or 35 slides that are easy to flow in and out of than have 12 slides that are just crammed full of information with a dozen bullet points with 14-point font. That stuff just doesn't work. More slides is all right. Don't get too hung up on it. You want to see a bad slide? Take a look at this one. This slide has a lot of bullet points. It has font size that's just too small. You notice the white background. It also has some alignment issues. Here's the crazy thing. This slide was recommended to me in Microsoft's design features. Within PowerPoint, there's a little design button and you click on it. It'll give you some tips on how you should design your slide. You can even pick one out of a list. And I did that here. Look what it comes up with. In my book, this is really a bad slide. So these first 6 tips that we've gone over all have to do with building out your slide deck. These last 4 I'm going to tell you about have to do more with the delivery and how you present this to an audience. First of all, where are you standing? You should be out front, in front of your audience. Now, you may not have much control over this if you are in an auditorium or at a trade show and you're behind a big podium. That's okay. More often than not, in a sales type environment, I found that I'm in a classroom or maybe a boardroom setting or even smaller. If that's the case, you want to stand up, you want to have your face and body right up in front where people can see you. Your facial expressions, your eye contact is just as important as your audience being able to see the slides behind you. So keep that in mind. Remember, a lot of times sales presentations, you're interacting with the audience. There's questions that are being asked. It's very important that you play off of that. Get yourself out in front. Stand in a prominent position. Now, don't block the screen, but at least be out there so everybody in the audience can see you. And if you do have a podium, remember, a lot of times classrooms have podiums. Don't go there. They're oftentimes in a dark corner. If you're presenting to a large audience in an auditorium, a lot of times the podium will have a spotlight on you and you'll be okay. But if you have a choice, you want to be out in front, especially if it's a smaller classroom type of setting, be out in front of your audience. This may seem obvious, but never, ever read your slides. And absolutely never turn your back to the audience. I see presenters all the time that turn their head and they're looking back at their screen and they're just reading verbatim what's on the slide deck. That's ridiculous. It shows a lack of preparedness and a lack of professionalism. Have your material ready to go. Practice it through so you don't need to read it. Never, ever, ever turn your back on the audience and don't talk to the screen. Talk to your audience, engage with them. Prepare and practice your materials so you don't fall into this trap. Here's something I almost always do. I have a digital copy of my presentation ready to go, either on a jump drive or ready to send out by email immediately after I finish my presentation to anybody in the audience who requests it. And sometimes, even if they don't request it, it gives me a reason to follow up with them, and I'll shoot them that digital copy. There's a lot of benefits to this. First of all, it gives you that reason to follow up. Secondly, you can oftentimes create a slightly different slide deck that has a little more information, some specifications, and some other details, maybe a brochure in there. And it oftentimes allows people to peruse your material, and I've even put testimonials in that PDF as well. So, a quick story. I was in Brazil, and this is 3 or 4 years ago, and a guy saw me. He was so happy to see me. He waved me down, and I had an appointment with his company, but he waved me down, and in broken English, he says, "I remember you." Turns out it wasn't me. It was my predecessor from a decade earlier. But my predecessor had left a jump drive with the digital presentation on it. And he'd given it to this guy. This guy learned that material and had shown this PowerPoint presentation around to a number of different people in his company. He became a champion for me. And turns out that this guy had a lot of relevant questions, and he really knew his stuff because that sales guy from a decade earlier had left behind a digital copy of his presentation. So it's really a good idea and a good thing to practice is sending out that digital copy of your presentation immediately afterwards. How many times have you come to the end of a presentation and the presenter puts on one last slide and all it says is thank you? Do not end your presentation this way. Always have a final slide that includes your picture and your contact information. Remember, a lot of times these presentations end with a Q&A session. Or even at a bigger conference, you're waiting for the next guy to get on stage. It could be up there for a couple of minutes or longer. Use this opportunity to advertise yourself. Like I say, I always put my picture up there, and I always have my contact information, and I ask people to connect with me on LinkedIn or visit my website. Don't miss this opportunity. Make sure your stuff is on there ready to go. Take these tips, and hopefully they can work for you, and you can build out that killer slide deck that is going to help you close that deal.